The heavy oak door of the town hall slammed shut behind me, sealing my fate with the finality of a guillotine blade. I clutched the eviction notice, the paper trembling in my hands as the ink seemed to bleed into the skin of my palms, mocking the signature of my own husband at the bottom. 3 hours ago, I was planning a celebratory dinner for our 10th anniversary, oblivious to the fact that my life, as I knew it, had been systematically dismantled while I slept. My mother-in-law, Martha, hadn't just orchestrated my ouster. She had managed to convince the bank, the courts, and even my husband, David, that the house I had inherited from my parents was legally theirs to liquidate. For 10 years, our home had been my sanctuary, a place filled with the scent of lavender and the soft hum of domestic bliss. I remember the way the morning light used to catch the dust motes dancing over the dining table, a table I had polished every Sunday for a decade. David and I were the picture of stability, or so I had convinced myself, despite the subtle fissures that had begun to spiderweb for our marriage over the last year. He was an architect, precise and meticulous, while I managed our small boutique bookstore. We were a team, a unit, or so the narrative went until Martha entered the equation. Martha, David's mother, was a woman who moved through a room like a gust of cold air. When she first came to stay with us, initially for a 2-week recovery period after a minor surgery, she kept her criticisms sharp but masked behind a facade of maternal concern. She didn't like the way I organized the pantry. She whispered that I was too focused on my career, and she constantly lamented that David's brilliant potential was being stifled by our lack of liquid capital. I had brushed it off as the quirks of an older woman trying to find her place in her son's life. I even felt pity for her, watching her rearrange our books and judge our spending. I never suspected that my mother-in-law saw my inheritance, that cozy Victorian house with the wraparound porch, not as a home, but as a strategic asset. She was a master of the long game, planting seeds of doubt in David's mind about my financial management, suggesting that he should be the one to hold the deed, just in case of an emergency. I had laughed it off back then, trusting that our love was bound by something stronger than property titles. I was foolish enough to believe that our shared life was an impenetrable fortress, guarded by the vows we had exchanged under the old oak tree in our backyard. Every Sunday, Martha would sit at our table, her eyes scanning the room, calculating the value of the silver, the heirloom rugs, and the structural integrity of the walls. I thought she was just being nosy. Now, looking back, I realize she was appraising her prize. The house was my anchor, a tangible piece of my parents' legacy, and it was the very thing she intended to rip from my grasp. The normalcy I clung to was nothing more than a well-rehearsed play, and I was the only person on stage who didn't know the ending. The tea tasted like chamomile and honey, sweet and soothing, completely hiding the bitter metallic aftertaste of a betrayal that had been brewing since the day she crossed my threshold. I was living in a dream, unaware that the floor beneath my feet had been replaced with a trapdoor, and Martha had been holding the lever the entire time, waiting for the perfect moment to let go. The first crack in the foundation appeared on a Tuesday. I had returned home early from the bookstore to find Martha standing in my study, her hand resting on the heavy brass-bound filing cabinet where I kept the original deeds and the sensitive financial documents my father had left me. She didn't jump or look guilty. Instead, she pulled her hand away with a slow, practiced grace, adjusting her silk cardigan as if she were merely dusting. She told me she was looking for a stapler, but her eyes, usually cold and calculating, held a strange, triumphant glint that chilled me to the bone. That night, when I mentioned it to David, he barely looked up from his blueprints. He just sighed, rubbing his temples, and said that his mother was getting old and restless, and I should really try to be more charitable. He sounded exhausted, a shell of the man who used to defend my every move against his mother's sharp tongue. The warnings grew more frequent, like low-frequency vibrations before an earthquake. I began to find odd handwritten notes on David's desk, rows of numbers, property appraisal figures, and the contact information for a law firm in the next city over. When I asked him about them, he claimed he was looking into refinancing options to future-proof us. He spoke about equity as if it were a dirty word, his voice losing its usual warmth. Then there were the phone calls. I would walk into the kitchen and the muffled, frantic tone of Martha's voice would instantly cut out. The silence that followed was heavier than the conversation itself. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a tenant in a place I had owned for years. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of the renovation project David was working on was making us both brittle. I ignored the way he avoided my touch, the way he turned his phone screen down whenever I entered the room. I convinced myself that if I just worked harder, loved more, and kept the peace, the normalcy would return. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day that felt weighted with impending disaster. David was away for an architectural conference, and I was deep in the office, trying to reconcile the store's tax accounts. The internet went down, and in my frustration, I grabbed David's laptop from the desk, thinking I could quickly use his hotspot to finish the submission. I clicked on his browser, intending only to check the store's email, but the homepage opened directly to a series of saved PDFs. My eyes caught a title that made my heart stutter. Irrevocable Property Transfer, Power of Attorney. My breath hitching in my throat like a jagged stone. With trembling fingers, I opened the document. It was a transfer of deed for our home, signed, notarized, and filed, listing Martha as the sole executor and David as the secondary beneficiary. But that wasn't even the worst part. Below it was a thread of emails between David and his mother, dated over the last 3 months. "She's so trusting, David, it's almost pathetic," Martha had written. "Once the title is moved, we can list the property, take our cut, and you can finally move on from this stifling life. You don't need her, and you certainly don't need that house weighing you down." David's reply arrived like a physical blow to my stomach, a sharp, twisting agony that made me double over. "I know, Mother. I'm doing my best to play the part. I'll have her sign the tax updates document when she's tired this weekend. She won't even notice she's signing away the deed." The world tilted on its axis. The color drained from the walls, the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window sounding like the closing of a tomb. My ears started to ring, a high-pitched, screeching sound that blocked out the rest of the house. I tried to stand, but my legs were made of lead, and I collapsed back into the chair, clutching the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned ivory white. A wave of nausea surged through me, sour and cold. I wasn't just being deceived. I was being dismantled. I wasn't a wife. I was a mark. Every smile David had given me in the last 6 months, every hug, every "I love you," it was all part of a surgical extraction. I wasn't just losing my house, I was losing the reality of my entire existence. The silence in the room was so thick it felt suffocating, a heavy shroud that smelled of old paper and betrayal. I sat there for what felt like hours, the blue light of the laptop screen bathing my face in a sickly, artificial pallor. I didn't cry. The shock had frozen my tear ducts, replacing grief with the cold, sharp clarity that felt like a blade against my ribs. When I heard the sound of David's car pulling into the gravel driveway, I didn't rush to greet him as I usually did. I didn't put on a pot of coffee or prepare a smile. Instead, I clicked the folder shut, stood up with a deliberate, haunting slowness, and walked toward the hallway. He entered the house, shaking off his umbrella, whistling a light, careless tune that shattered against the oppressive atmosphere of the entryway. He looked up, his face breaking into that practiced, charming grin that had fooled me for a decade. "Hey, love, the drive was a nightmare, but I'm glad to be—" The words died on his lips when he saw me standing at the top of the stairs, my arms crossed, my expression as unreadable as a tombstone. "Did you have a good time discussing my future with your mother, David?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. It was a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. His smile flickered, a momentary glitch in his performance. He laughed, a nervous, brittle sound. "What are you talking about, sweetheart? You look pale. Are you feeling okay?" He took a step toward the stairs, reaching out as if to brush a lock of hair from my forehead, but I recoiled as if his touch were a live wire. "Don't," I snapped. The word cracked through the air like a gunshot. I saw the emails. I saw the D-transfer. I know that my house, the one my parents worked their entire lives to leave me, has been rebranded as your mother's retirement fund. David's face drained of color, his jaw dropping open. He stammered, It's not what it looks like. You're overreacting. It's just a temporary measure for tax purposes. You wouldn't understand the legal side of—" "Save the lecture for the judge," I interrupted, walking down the stairs until I was inches from him. I could smell the faint scent of stale coffee on his breath, and the expensive cologne I had bought him for his birthday, a gift bought with my own money. "I saw the timestamp on the documents, David. You didn't just suggest this. You hired a lawyer to strip me of my inheritance behind my back. You've been looking for a buyer for 3 weeks." Before he could pivot into his next lie, the front door swung open again. Martha stepped in, shaking out her scarf, looking like a queen surveying her new fiefdom. She stopped when she saw us, her gaze flicking between David's panicked expression and my icy glare. She didn't look remorseful, she looked annoyed, as if a servant had dropped a platter of expensive china. "Oh good, you've told her," Martha said, her tone utterly casual as she began to unzip her coat. "I told you, David, the suspense was only going to make her more hysterical. Honestly, dear, you should be thanking us. You were never good at managing the upkeep of a property this size. It was a burden, and we've simply lifted it from your shoulders." The audacity was so blinding it was almost laughable. I turned to look at her, really looking at her. The expensive silk of her scarf, the manicured nails that had signed away my past, and felt a shift inside me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. "You didn't lift the burden, Martha," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You committed fraud, and you were sloppy enough to leave the trail wide open." "Fraud?" Martha let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, stepping past me to head toward the kitchen as if the conversation were already concluded. "It's not fraud when the owner signs the documents herself. You signed that tax update last month, didn't you? You didn't even read the pages. You were too busy making my son a cup of tea. It's pathetic, really." David stood by, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look up at his mother. He just shrank into himself, a coward, waiting for the storm to pass so he could go back to his comfortable, stolen life. That silence, that pathetic, hollow silence, was the final nail in the coffin of my marriage. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting an opportunistic mother-in-law. I was fighting a man who had sold his soul to win her approval, and in doing so, had decided I was the currency. The air in the living room felt thin, charged with the ozone of a storm about to break. Martha poured herself a glass of wine, her movements fluid and unbothered, while David remained a statue of shame by the door. "You think you've won because you have a piece of paper with a forged intent signature?" I asked, my voice gaining volume, cutting through the silence of the house. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up, the screen glowing. "I've spent the last 3 hours since I found that folder. While you were driving home, David, I was speaking to an attorney. And not just any attorney. I called the one who handled my parents' estate, the one who actually filed the original deed 30 years ago." Martha paused, the glass halfway to her lips. For the first time, her hand betrayed her, a tiny tremor causing the liquid to swirl. "A lawyer? Don't be dramatic. You don't have the funds to fight us. You don't even have access to the joint account anymore. I had David move those assets to a high-yield account in his name yesterday morning. David finally looked up, his eyes darting between us, a flicker of panic replacing his cowardice. What? No, Mother, you said— I said we were securing our future, David, Martha snapped, her voice losing its icy composure. She's a soft-hearted child who plays shopkeeper with books. She wouldn't know how to handle a real legal fight if it hit her in the face. You're right about one thing, Martha, I said, stepping toward her. I felt the physical weight of my own strength now, a grounded, terrifying calm. I have played the part of the soft-hearted child. I let you criticize my decor, I let you dictate my schedule, and I let you make me feel small. But you made a fatal error. You assumed that because I was kind, I was stupid. I walked over to the mantel and picked up a heavy leather-bound album, the family record. I flipped to the back, pulling out a hidden envelope that had been tucked behind a photograph of my parents. You thought you had all the documents, didn't you? You scoured the study, you raided the safe, and you even went through my coat pockets. But you didn't check the one place in this house where you refused to spend time because you thought it was too sentimental. Martha's eyes widened. That's just old photos, you idiot. It's the original trust document, I corrected, my heart thumping a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The one that stipulates this house cannot be transferred, sold, or leveraged without a secondary signature from the family executor, who is my cousin, not David. Your sale and transfer are null and void before they even reach the court. And since you already started the process of liquidating, you just provided the evidence of a felony. You're not just going to lose the house, Martha. You're going to lose your standing, your credit, and potentially your freedom. David walked toward me, his face a mask of desperate realization. Wait, honey, let's just talk about this. We can fix this, right? It was just a misunderstanding. We were planning on giving you back a portion once the sale went through. We were just confused about the ownership rights. Confused? I laughed, a harsh, dry sound that had no humor in it. You are a licensed architect, David. You build structures for a living. You knew exactly how fragile the foundation of this lie was, and you built it anyway. Martha slammed her glass down on the mahogany side table. A fine spiderweb of cracks appeared in the wood, and the glass chipped, spilling red wine like a fresh wound across the surface. You little witch, she hissed, her mask of maternal grace finally shattering to reveal the desperate, ugly predator underneath. You think you're so righteous. You're a parasite living in a house you didn't earn, clinging to the ghosts of parents who died to give you a life you don't deserve. At least my parents left me a home, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous low register. Yours just left you a legacy of bitterness and a son who's too weak to be a man. The silence that followed was absolute. David looked as if I'd struck him across the face. He reached out to grab my arm, but I stepped back, my eyes cold. Don't touch me. I've already called the police to report the unauthorized access to my financial accounts. They'll be here within the hour. I suggest you decide right now who you're going to blame when they start asking questions. Martha's face turned a mottled, furious red. David, tell her she's lying. Tell her you're the owner. David looked at his mother, then at me, then at the phone in my hand, and the last shred of his resolve crumbled. He slumped into the armchair, burying his face in his hands. I can't, he whispered. I think she's right, Mother. We went too far. You coward, Martha screamed, lunging for him, but I was already moving toward the door, my phone recording, my heart finally clear. The trap had been set, and I was the one who had finally pulled the trigger. The transition from victim to survivor didn't happen in a sudden burst of fireworks. It happened in the quiet, methodical ticking of the clock while the police processed the evidence. As the officers stood in my living room, taking statements and collecting the forged documents I had painstakingly laid out on the kitchen island, a strange, profound stillness settled over me. Martha was in the corner, her face a mask of furious, impotent resentment. trying to charm the responding officer, only to be met with a cold, professional indifference of the law. David sat at the table, his head bowed, looking smaller and more pathetic than I ever imagined a man could. He wasn't the architect who built our future anymore. He was just a man who had gambled away his integrity and lost. The transformation was absolute. I realized then that my house wasn't just wood and glass. It was the physical manifestation of my own self-worth, and for the first time, I refused to let anyone else define its value. Watching Martha being escorted to a squad car, her manicured fingers clawing at the air as she shouted about her reputation, didn't give me the rush of victory I had expected. Instead, it gave me peace. It was the sound of a closing door, the final, satisfying click of a lock that would never be opened again. The legal aftermath was a grueling, drawn-out affair, but the outcome was never in doubt. My cousin, the true executor of the trust, arrived with a team of lawyers who dismantled Martha's web of lies with clinical precision. David's role as an accomplice to financial fraud and elder manipulation, since he had lied to his own mother about the status of the accounts, meant his career as an architect was effectively over. He resigned before the board could revoke his license, and his name became a whisper of scandal in the professional circles he had worked so hard to impress. As for Martha, the public exposure of her attempt to defraud her own family cost her the social circle she valued above all else. She lost her home, her influence, and, eventually, any semblance of contact with her son. 6 months later, the house felt different. The lingering smell of lavender and old books remained, but the oppressive, cold weight of Martha's presence was gone, replaced by a light, airy clarity. I had renovated the study, the room where the betrayal began, tearing out the desk where David had plotted and replacing it with a small library nook where I could sit and read in absolute golden sunlight. I stood on the wraparound porch on a crisp autumn evening, a mug of herbal tea cradled in my hands. The town was quiet, the same town that had whispered about our perfect marriage. Now they whispered about my resilience. A car pulled up to the curb. It was my sister, coming over for dinner. I watched her walk up the path, her laughter carrying on the wind, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I wasn't the woman who had cried in the bank or trembled in the hallway anymore. I looked down at the old Victorian house, my anchor and my home, and realized I had been wrong about one thing. I hadn't been fighting to keep a building. I had been fighting to reclaim the woman who lived inside it. I had survived the theft of my past, only to find that I was the architect of my own future. As I turned back to open the door, I didn't look over my shoulder for the ghosts of my mistakes. They were gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing in the light of my own making. True freedom isn't found in what you protect. It's found in what you're willing to let burn to ensure that only the truth remains.